Star Trek Deep Space Nine is the third live-action Star Trek series. Much like its predecessor Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine ran for 7 seasons, from 1993 to 1999. It also featured the return of TNG regulars Chief Miles Edward O'Brien, his wife Keiko, and of course, Worf, the grumpiest Klingon in the quadrant. But the similarities end there. Deep Space Nine was the first Star Trek series to be done without the involvement of the late, great Gene Roddenberry. It was the first to be set primarily on a space station rather than a ship. It was the first to utilize long-form serialized storytelling over one-off episodic fare. Deep Space Nine featured a black captain, Benjamin Sisko, with a child, Jake, neither of which has been attempted on Star Trek before or since. It paved the way for a show that heavily featured cast regulars who did not work for Starfleet, which would go on to be the standard for Star Trek Voyager. A focus on religion, trips to the unknown Gamma Quadrant, and Ferengi that fans actually like. Deep Space Nine remains the most unique Star Trek show just based on its firsts alone. But there's so much more to DS9, a show which started as the redheaded stepchild of Star Trek, but has, over time, come to be known by many as the greatest Star Trek ever made. Now, why did it start out as the redheaded stepchild? Well, much like TNG before it, Deep Space Nine faced major challenges right out of the gate. The show's concept, for example, which revolves around a space station that deals with different, frequently political interspecies issues week to week, may have been very different for Star Trek, but it sounded very familiar to famed science fiction writer J. Michael Straczynski at the time. And that is probably because he pitched that very idea to Paramount under a different title, which you are probably familiar with, Babylon 5, a show that JMS wound up making on his own at the same time that Deep Space Nine was airing. And while Straczynski has let bygones be bygones, there is a general consensus that while DS9's original showrunners, Michael Piller and Rick Berman, probably didn't know about Babylon 5, Paramount executives certainly did. And back in 1992, before DS9 even first aired, fans of Straczynski were swift and pretty consistent in calling out Deep Space Nine as being a Babylon 5 knockoff. And 25 years later, some people still do say that, despite how much the shows diverged in their storylines even very early on. And you thought your current fandoms had drama. There's other stuff too. Sisko's de facto first officer, the Bajoran Major Kira, was created whole cloth because Michelle Forbes, who played Rolaren on TNG, didn't want her own show for some reason, and that's kind of what DS9 was originally going to be. Avery Brooks, who played Ben Sisko, he had to grow out his hair, which stressed him out because he preferred shaving his head. You know, head acting is important. And there were rumors that unlike the jovial set of TNG, Deep Space Nine's production was gravely serious for like years. And yes, all that plus the at times unwieldy serialized storytelling and a host of other challenges were partly responsible for why the next Star Trek series, Voyager, premiered only 2 years after DS9 got its start. Now that sounds dire, but remember that none of the actors from Star Trek The Next Generation thought their show would even last 1 season, let alone 7, and like TNG, Deep Space Nine survived its early challenges to become one of the most seminal and influential series in science fiction history. Now, how did that happen? How did Deep Space Nine come to be so beloved? Well, the first thing that happened is that the story of Deep Space Nine is incredible. It's, again, a little unwieldy because there's so many characters involved and so many twists and turns along the way, but here's the gist. Benjamin Sisko is a Starfleet commander who's raising his son Jake on his own after the death of his wife Jennifer at the hands of the Borg. Sisko gets assigned to a new post as the commanding officer in charge of Deep Space Nine, a space station that was formerly owned by an alien race of lizard-like aliens called the Cardassians. The Cardassians are kind of like space Nazis. They've been occupying, pillaging, and otherwise torturing the peoples on a planet called Bajor, which Starfleet has some interest in bringing into the Federation, but What nobody knows is that nearby there is the only ever recorded stable wormhole which leads to the mysterious Gamma Quadrant. And inside the wormhole itself are atemporal, nigh omnipotent aliens that the Bajorans see as their gods, who they call the Prophets. And the Prophets choose Benjamin Sisko to be their emissary. And throughout the rest of Deep Space Nine's many plots, their dealings with the Cardassians, their trouble with mirror universe versions of themselves, rekindled conflict with the Klingons, unrest within the Federation, and all-out war with the Dominion from the Gamma Quadrant, the undercurrent is always about Ben and Bajor. The original Star Trek was pitched as Wagon Train in Space. Similarly, Deep Space Nine was pitched as The Rifleman in Space. And The Rifleman is a Western about a man and his son who come to a dilapidated town out on America's frontier. But really, in addition to being about a lot of other things, deep down in my mind, Deep Space Nine is a Passover story, with Sisko as Moses and the Bajorans as Jews. They're Jews in space. It's good to be the emissary. It's actually not. Like Moses, Ben does not believe his burning bush, the Prophets, are right that he could or should be the one to lead these people from enslavement to a new promised land. Like Moses, despite himself, Ben rises above false gods like the Pa-Wraiths and a Cardassian leader, Gul Dukat, who, like Pharaoh, retains a cold heart in the face of those who he has brought to suffer. Like Moses, Ben, even though he may not know it at first, is one with the people whom he must save. And, biblical spoiler alert, like Moses, Ben is not destined to live in that promised land he spends his life bringing the Bajorans towards. It's a pretty good story, so if you haven't seen it before, definitely don't pass over it. Anyway, you got it, I'm really sorry. So, that's a big part of what Deep Space Nine is about and why it's beloved. But Benjamin Sisko is not the only character, and you haven't really retrospected Deep Space Nine if you don't talk about her crew. You've got the Major, Kira Nerys, who was a former freedom fighter during the Cardassian occupation of Bajor. There's Kira's secret admirer, Odo, the station Clint Eastwood-inspired security chief, who also happens to be a shape-shifting alien, basically. He's like Spock and Data, but with a severe case of the grumps. There's Odo's nemesis, Quark, a Ferengi who, along with his brother Rom and his nephew Nog, run the station bar. And then there's your barflies, Miles O'Brien, the engineer who has the worst luck in Starfleet, and Dr. Julian Bashir, who is secretly genetically enhanced, just like Kirk's best friend. Bashir has a crush on Jadzia Dax, who is a Trill, which means she's got an alien in her stomach that has lived many lifetimes. So Jadzia, she's kind of like the Doctor from Doctor Who, basically. And she falls in love and marries Worf, who again is the grumpiest Klingon in the Quadrant. And he loves prune juice. But more than anything, when you look at Deep Space Nine in retrospect, it's the eccentricity of the show that makes it stand out. Because DS9 isn't just the best Star Trek, it's also the wildest. For example, TNG set out to make Ferengi their main villains, but they were so unpopular that they got pushed into the background. But Deep Space Nine writers saw that as a challenge and took TNG's failed villains, who were invented by Roddenberry and initially pitched as having enormous dongs, by the way. That is really true, you can look it up. And they turned them into the low-key greatest heroes in all of Star Trek. Despite their obsession with profit, despite their weird erotic ear fixation, it's called Umux, you can look that up too. And despite their extremely sexist society that requires women to be nude in public and have no rights over basically anything, the Ferengi still somehow represent the best Star Trek has to offer. Quark repeatedly uses greedy capitalism, of all things, to convince even the most unscrupulous villains to do the moral thing. Rom helps create a union on the station for all the workers while being an invaluable engineer. And Nog, who starts out as a lowly thief, becomes the first ever Ferengi Starfleet officer, and one of the most storied heroes of the Dominion War. But also, you know, sometimes the Ferengi travel in time to manipulate humans into giving them stuff, and also get roped into helping their mostly morally bankrupt leader, Grand Naga Zek. And also, Quark gets a sex change for an episode.
Well, how do I look?
Don't ask. Writer and producer Ira Steven Behr has gone on record saying that the Ferengi, more so than any other race on DS9, including the 24th century humans, are the best, most honest representation of humans from the 20th century. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, whether it's Kira's alternate universe bisexual counterpart, the Intendant, who's always trying to sleep with and kill everyone, or that the station's humble tailor, Garrick, is in actuality the most deadly spy the Cardassians ever produced, or how Sisko's love of baseball yielded a home game between his crew, going by the Niners, and a team entirely comprised of hyper-competitive Vulcans. The crew goes back in time because of tribbles. There's a terrible episode involving alien hopscotch. And oh yes, they introduce a recurring character who is a holographic lounge singer named Vic Fontaine, who helps solve the crew's personal problems. In one episode, they do an Ocean's 11 heist story because Vic's program gets taken over by the mob somehow. And that's just the on-camera stuff. The actors who play Kira and Bashir, Nana Visitor and Alexander Siddig, got married, they had a kid, the resulting pregnancy of which had to be incorporated into the show. In fact, Siddig was initially going to play Sisko, and his playing Bashir was very unpopular with Paramount producers for like a really long time. And poor Cole Meany, who played Miles O'Brien, had storylines that were so consistently dire. Episodes featuring him were often referred to as O'Brien Must Suffer rather than by their actual titles. Deep Space Nine, it's a crazy show. But ultimately, Deep Space Nine is the Star Trek that predicted the serialized sci-fi storytelling of today. Not least of which because one of the show's producers and writers, Ronald D. Moore, went on to be showrunner for Sci-Fi's Battlestar Galactica, aka one of the most defining sci-fi series of the 21st century. And it also found a way to keep the hyper-idealized 24th century we got to know on Star Trek The Next Generation, and give it that kind of warts that made it more familiar to our own world, but without losing the dream, the magic, that hope endemic to Star Trek. Anyway, that's it. I'm off to Quark's. Gonna drink a little Canar, hang out with my Dabo girl Lita, grab my boy Morn, show Bashir and Miles how darts is done, and I don't know, fly me to the moon with Vic Fontaine while Odo plays the keys. Maybe I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.